that is now on. And so let us start the show here. And there's our clicky-clats and ratchets and so forth and so on, which I think I can hear, but nobody else can. So it's all silent pictures. You can imagine what telephones and telegraphs and clocks and typewriters and all that used to sound like in the ancient days, back when we were younger than we were. Troubles in Paradise, Methodology of Creationism, Evolution Hour. Away we go for another show, and we've got our pal and co-author Jackson here, where we are talking about all sorts of stuff and such. And I'll start off with a completely trivial point that I was showing you, because this is such a stupid thing. I got a blip in the email. God's Holy Spirit instructed us to loan you this to start turning things around for you. So here it is, and be blessed. It's a chain letter that you find popping up in the Christian subculture and others. But anyway, it's they sent me a biblical handkerchief, a prayer handkerchief that I was to send on and also hopefully send money. And here is the handkerchief, which is a printout, paper thing. I mean, at least have the dignity to send an actual physical handkerchief and not a picture. This is like McGree's. This is not a pipe. Well, this is not a prayer handkerchief.
That's a good comparison.
Yeah. Anyway, that'll probably be alluded to in some point if I can ever get around to revising some of the big stack of material on the biblical creationism aspect and its religious subculture and all of that stuff, and prayers and miracles and all of that. The old chapter 6 of the old book. Anyway, for those again who have living in a cave or have tried to block out my existence in their head from each week, I am doing as a primary thing the Contested Bones book, which was a request from a viewer to analyze it from a source methods direction, because they didn't feel like this had the stomach for it. And so that's what I've been doing week on week. No surprise, Jackson, that the pattern holds, that about half of it is authority quoting, and of the sources that are in there, they're still running at under 1.7 sources per page, which is paltry. And then also that they've got a really cute average going climbing, that the technical literature that they've been putting in, about 50% of it they're misrepresenting, either by suppressing data that's in it or mangling the context, the authority quoting elements and all that. And that's a horribly high. It should be 0. That you're never misrepresenting primary sources, but boy, they just do it all the time. And the area that I've been diving into today was on the scapula and upper torso and the way the clavicle structure is. They have a little section on that where they're pulling a cute little shell game, that they're trying to argue that Homo naledi is just perfectly within the range of human beings, and to show that, they in one case say, well, it's like Neanderthal, which are perfectly normal humans. No, that was their assertion, but no, they're not in our species. So that's a bad example. And then the other one was the closest they could get to the kind of variations that you can see in naledi are in the Turkana boy, which is a juvenile of one of our non-species members in the genus. They're not our species either. And this is perfectly intelligible from how developmental processes are changing the physical anatomy and all of that. But anyway, I found several of the papers that they alluded to that were full text. So I put the links up to that so everybody can read and see what the actual data field are and observe what's going on in here. Oh, more people there. We got Brian Stevens. Sorry, way late was doing things. It was important beyond my note. Yeah, I started off really late here too. I was just barely getting started on here, and I was worried that maybe Jackson might not be able to show up or not, because he's doing work and classes and all these other things. So yay that you're here, and that's good feedback. So also, Jackson, you can keep an eye on the live chat to see what kind of questions or comments and that come along, or if we're losing the audience. Because everybody is going, what the hell is he going on about? But I'm just fascinated at the relentless pigeonholing that Rupe and Sanford have to do, which you've seen in the same context writing the book that we're working on. They've got their tropes that have to be true, and they are in trouble if they cite primary source literature, because then you can look that up and you can see you got that from this. How the hell did you manage to do that? The technical literature continues to plow on about these things, and it should be pointed out the obvious that Homo naledi, nobody in the paleoanthropology field is classifying them as Homo sapiens for obvious reasons, because they aren't Homo sapiens. And so any attempts to try to cram them into our genus by selectively talking about a tiny aspect of something, the xeno-slicing phenomenon is what I called it in the old book. If you're familiar with Xeno and the Zeno's paradox, where the tortoise and the Achilles are at a race, and Achilles supposedly can never catch up because the tortoise always has a head start. And what he's attempting to do, of course, is add up an infinite series of integrals, and poor old Zeno didn't have calculus back in those days, so he was stuck. But xeno-slicing as a phenomenon is very common in creationism, where people will tunnel vision in on a tiny little aspect of something to the exclusion of all of its context, so that it looks, there it is, see, that fits my model just fine, except I don't tell you what my model is. And that's the other thing that just pisses me off royally about Rupe and Sanford, is you never hear what their model is, or what they would accept. So, okay, you're arguing that Homo naledi is not in fact transitional. Okay, what would it need to look like to be transitional? What features would it need to have different for you to go, well, now that is a transitional? No, you never get that. There are zero examples in Rupe and Sanford, and I've never seen examples of it anywhere in anti-evolutionism. And you've been plowing through all those Answers in Genesis books. Have you encountered any yet?
Have I encountered the xeno-slicing?
Of any example of any anti-evolutionist complaining about a transitional form and telling you what it would look like, that they would accept it if it looked like that?
Nope.
Zero. I don't know of any counterexample. And if anybody watching the videos or connecting up to anybody else has ever seen an example, please bring it to my attention, because we'll want to look at it and discuss it. But I know of none. What you get are pot shots and complaints about, well, we don't like this, and we don't like that, and we don't like that, and we don't like that, through the xeno-slicing thing, but never a positive argument.
Similar to your point about the naledi, Minton brings up Tiktaalik by looking at the mud skipper, because that's relevant.
Yeah. Let's not talk about the actual taxon. That it's really insects, of course, has transitional horns, claws, scales, feathers, fur, giraffe's neck. The field about, if you're going to, the example I like to use is a Buick in a junkyard. If you're going to claim there are no Buicks in the junkyard, don't you have to have an idea what a Buick is supposed to look like? Otherwise, how do you know you haven't found a Buick part? And the same would apply to Studebakers, for those of you who can remember what a Studebaker was. Or for that matter, let's just say a Yugo. Maybe that's a little bit closer to home for an extinct automobile. But if you're always finding ways of
future car,
the DeLorean, DeLorean. Yeah, you still see them every once in a while. There's a reason why naked stainless steel is not used for cars. It's because it's hard to keep pristine, and it's a fuss potty kind of a thing. So it's a mess. And a walk down memory lane with it was also called the snowmobile, because DeLorean at one point was selling cocaine to finance parts of the car and all that. It was just a weird circumstance.
Wow.
Cool. Yeah. He was having trouble. He was an I think Ford executive who decided to branch out on his own and make the car, and he was having trouble financing it. And it was a point where he was selling drugs to do it. It was just a terrible scandal. There were very few made, so they're extremely rare. So they're worth a fortune. And of course, gained immortality when it was used in Back to the Future. In fact, I think I couldn't resist acquiring one of the models, which is the one with the Mr. Fusion on the back end, which, by the way, now this is from the past. That was from like 2015 or whatever it was, when they went into Back to the Future into the year 2015, which is now in the past. So our future isn't quite the same. They got some of it right, but other things, there is no hoverboards and that, but the wall screens and interactive televisions and stuff like that. But nobody was anticipating this, which is ubiquitous smartphones and all of that. So that's kind of like a side. I'm completely off the rails now in terms of topic, but just say that as a general issue, science fiction writers are not very good at predicting the future. They can predict elements of it, and bits. Flat screen television sets were something that H.G. Wells envisaged for the 21st century back in 1935. But a lot of the details of how culture plays out with our technical tools, no, they're terrible at it. And they don't realize that, well, it's something that's very difficult to do because cultures are constructed from umpteen different variables. They're nonlinear. So to try to anticipate the future, you can't because there's too many variables involved. But Brian says transitional features are common, yes, but all foils are presumed to be presumed to be transitional in some form. Yeah, everything. Here's an irony, and in fact, I'm making a point of putting it in the new chapter on kinds that Jackson and Wheat and I are doing. I'm highlighting it. Is that functionally speaking, what evolution says in a creationist context is all life on Earth is a monobaromon. And it's one gigantic interconnected network. And creationists can aspect little teeny snippets of that at monobaromons, but they still have to draw the line at holobaromons, which are created types. And for that, they got to have us as a separate type. But boy, are they loose on everything else. I was just reading the section that you had written in about how between the tyrannosaurs and then they go on about the antelopes to where suddenly Leitner and company are really fussy about splitting up all of these little antelope cousins.
Oh yes. Well, their reasoning for it floored me because they said no.
Floored me too.
They said most people tend to think of these groups as different, so that's why they're different. And I was like, did I read that actually?
Yeah, I put in a line about it because you were talking about it was like by majority rule, which is not how science works. And I says, yeah, it's as if a taxonomy were a category at the People's Choice Awards.
Because all the antelope and the cows are in bovidae. It's like sheep, cows, a bunch of different antelope. They're all bovids, and so they can't have this. All these variations within their one kind.
Yeah, people are going to complain because well, that's not a cow, that's something else. And because it bumps into familiar forms. Anything that relates to barnyard animals or animals that you shoot with a gun with for hunting today are ones that are enough in their consciousness that they have to treat them as separate. But unfamiliar animals, like all of the tyrannosaurids that get compacted together in one big lump, they can do that effortlessly because they don't have a direct experience with it. And it's a colossal double standard, and it makes for rib tickling systematics. I tell you, it's funny.
Because one of the things we do is we point out that one of the kind of funny things about it is they say, oh, well, species is man-made classification, so we're going to go with the family level. Well, that's even more arbitrary than a species is. Yeah. And then they can take, like, I think we used the rove beetle Staphylinidae, which has like 30,000 species within it.
Oh, I think it was even a higher number than that, 64,000.
64,000. Yeah,
I pointed out in the book that was more than mammals, reptiles, and birds put together.
And somehow they're all one kind.
One grade, yeah. Well, the creationists are very bad thinking about insects. For one thing, they don't envisage them being on the ark, So the idea of gathering together all of the cute little bugs to put on the thing. No, this is not something that they tend to think of them as vermin. And so they just don't want to bother about them. And therefore they are left to their own devices off the ark. And creationists are really not wanting to think about that. And along with sea creatures in general, which they don't want to bother about thinking about fish and whales and what they do in salinity levels and predator-prey relationships and all that. What was predation going on the sea creatures, but not on land animals? It's a thing they just don't want to talk about because it's going to really be awkward. It's testing all of their paradigms. And the insects, holy moly, if anybody is intimidated by a few thousand species of mammals, sorting them out, they are up shit creek when it comes to insects with 500,000 beetles and all. I mean, it's just just
Yeah.
colossal.
Reminds, was it the mayor quote where it's like, an inordinate fondness for beetles?
Huxley. Julian Huxley, I think. That's not Julian Huxley. Oh gosh, JBS Haldane. There we go. Maybe that was him. My mind is going, Dave. I can feel it. But yes, he was asked if God had any interest or any characteristics, an inordinate fondness for beetles, and I could say nematodes. There's upwards easily of 500,000 species of nematodes living in places you probably don't want to know too much about. So that there's a huge diversity of nature, and that's the permanent snag that all creationist systematics has, is the sheer data field. I made a point of adjusting some of the text to explicitly make that clear, is that they start out, the reason why Marsh couldn't work out baraminology back in the 1940s is there was too much data. Well, boy, he was operating from a sliver compared to the data we have now. Our fossil record is vastly improved over what was available in the 1940s. And we have all that direct genetics, and it's only getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And they're never going to catch up. They're always going to have to just play shuffleboard, trying to rescue things, and they're going to end up with the double standard, because there's no way you can leave all those tyrannosaurs or all the horse sequence as a baramin and yet not link up humans with Neanderthals, with Homo erectus, with Australopithecines, with Bonzo the chimp, and all of that. It's too big of a category. So they have to use double standards or parse their data field down and flush data, which you see when you look at it at the source methods approach. Source methods, man. It's the ultimate opportunity, and we'll be demonstrating in our book how wonderful and informative all of this stuff is. And I've started the spreadsheet analysis too. It's going to take me a while to go through it, so I thought I better start fairly early, of calculating just how many sources we have and under what category, because I don't yet know exactly all that is. I did that for Evolution Slam Dunk, where I had like 2,300 sources. And let's see. Insects are cool says JBS Haldane, God has an inordinate fondness for beetles. It's a bit of an apocryphal thing, in fact, because they're not entirely sure where he said it, as I recall, but it's one that's attributed to him, and it's a nice one. But that would apply to almost any level of taxa. If any of you are biological groupies, you will already be aware of your favorite animal, just how much is being known about it, and how fascinating and in-depth it all is. And I was doing the same. Yeah.
I love
jump in there, Jackson.
I love elephants. And for some reason, I guess God decided to make elephants most closely related to manatees and hyraxes, and then within that clade, have them start out as small, like pig-like semi-aquatic critters, just like a whole bunch of other tethitharians, and then they, make it look like they slowly became terrestrial and grew a trunk and tusks and all of that. And well, what's the point of all that? All that nonsense.
Yeah, it's and the same thing applies in any bloody little area. You've got the dinosaur formes, you got the mammalia formes, you got the crocodilia formes. That one of the canards that falls apart in anti-evolutionism is if you look at any major group for which you've got a pretty good fossil record. It doesn't need to be complete. It only needs to be better than nothing. You'll start seeing at any arbitrary point, you'll see a group that is hard to pin down where it fits in. And the reason why it's hard to pin down where it is because it's now so generalized that it looks about like its cousins. Bipedality, the thing that really has struck me about how the theropod systematics has changed over the last 20 years or more, is how many bloody little bipedal critters there are like this, Lagasucids and all these others that are at the very base of the dinosaur family tree. And the dinosaurs developed a particularly rigid, upright body stance as opposed to their cousins. And that's probably the adaptive reason why dinosaurs took off. They were just a little bit more agile. They were just a little better at it than their competitors, and it drove the other ones out. and they became the dominant landform. And then, only then, over millions of years, did they start proliferating into diverse forms. And the same thing for the ornithischians. The earliest ones of those are little bipedal critters, little teeter-totter thingies. And so the similarities between basal dinosaurs, that's why the Herrerasaurs, one of this thing, there was intelligent designers were just fuming, and some creationists have done the same thing over the new systematic, where they're questioning whether or not theropods are in the same group as sauropods or not, and should be split up into 3 ones, and that one is closer related to ornithischians than the other. It had to do with those damn Herrerasaurs and these basal groups that were almost this and not quite that. And the cladistic analysis is measuring these things out. I suspect that it will probably hold up as an analysis over time. I mean, you got some pretty heavy guns thinking this through on that. And of course, it'll be decided by the luck of the draw to see if the fossil genie comes in. BJ says, ooh, question for Jackson then. Jackson, bit on your ball there. Elephants really, really hate wild dogs who like to annoy them. Is that from when elephants were smaller and dog predecessor were bigger? I have a notion on that, but give that a whack.
I have absolutely no idea. That is indeed the case. That's possible, I guess. I mean, dogs are pack hunters, and possible.
I would suspect it's a relatively recent circumstance, because the canids the dog groups are relatively recent. The ecosystem they're operating in is relatively recent. So it wouldn't be, but by the time the elephants, they get to be fairly bulky fairly early. I think it's much more likely about the complaints about how they interact in the particular ecosystem. So you're looking at ecomorphs and niche partitioning and all this kind of stuff going on in there. So I suspect it's a relatively recent phenomenon.
I mean, you had
like 10 million years.
The first elephants were semi-aquatic grazers, like Meratherium, and then when they became terrestrial, you had like Phyramia and Dinotherium. Relatively.
What was the time frame on that? My memory is blocky on that.
Eocene was like, or I think the first elephants come out of the very latest Paleocene, and then you see
maybe about 30 million, or is that?
That's like upwards of like I think 40, 45 or so million
even earlier. Yeah, so we're even talking about quite different ecosystems involved.
Right, because
we got to disconnect arid Africa savannas from the equation, because that wasn't the case.
Egypt was a tropical jungle in the Eocene, from what I understand, and so
almost everything was. And the same thing that you could have grown wine in England. It was all that was tropical too.
Yeah, and so like you said, they got pretty big relatively early on. You had guys like Phyramia and these other early large elephants. Like by the
here's a superb end. C. Brown asks, what did dogs evolve from?
Oh, well, that's actually a really interesting question. Dogs and bears are both closely related to each other, and they come from these forms that are sort of like both. Because dogs are digitigrade, they walk on their toes, but their ancestors walked on their palms like bears do. And so I think it's the Amphicyonidae. It's one of those early groups, the bear dogs, which are like very large and bulky because they.
C. Brown is a creationist, by the way. So you're supplying information to him that he may or may not ever bother to look up.
Right, and then Beach points out the Miacids. That's even further back.
Yeah.
When you get to the common ancestor of Caeniformes and Feliformes, then you get the Miacids. And there's actually
hate about any of those. They avoid all of those bits if they can, because cats and dogs are so familiar to everybody that the last thing they want to do is start pointing at the almosts in the fossil record.
The first weasels and seals, which are also both Caeniformes. You have Caeniformes as bears, dogs, weasels, seals. Weasels and seals, who are I think sister to each other, both the earliest of them both look very similar. Big surprise, because
common to say.
Yeah, because they're closely related to each other. Bears and dogs are sister to each other, and their earliest representatives look very similar.
And I'm afraid, C. Brown, we will not answer a basic question: what did Gogs evolve from? You must learn to spell better when you type. He may be on his cell phone. He sometimes does this from his car driving back and forth to places and all that. You know, don't text while you drive, kid.
And there's
But anyway, there's an enormous amount of technical literature here. And believe you me, you can look it up. And if you don't look it up, it's because you are C. Brown says, what's the evidence? Because they have subtle similarities. I'm very familiar with the bear dog. That is a myth. Oh, C, please, by all means,
really?
Put your source base. Put your source base up in the comments. Once the videos, come on in and give us some sources on what you claim to be the bear dog myth, and we'll see whether or not you stack up on the systematic.
These similarities also aren't subtle. It's pretty clear to see that you have digitigrade dogs and plantigrade ancestors who are
genetics.
Twice the size.
We can trace these groups even from their extant relatives to be able to sort all this stuff out. You know, it's an interdisciplinary field, and of course, C. Brown is not going to have much in the way of creationism to parrot on this. He, of course, has been haunting the things. If you're familiar with it, he's been haunting the various analyses that I've been doing on contested bones over these many weeks. And basically all he does is trawl creationist literature and repeat the claims. He's like standing for truth, but less technical.
I haven't talked to Standing in a while. I totally gave up on him, or have given up on him.
Yeah, he's got only one trick pony going on. The various debates that he's done since then, it's all yawn. I mean, the same thing. Okay, heterozygosity. Ooh, we were really looking forward to that one. You know, it's the same shtick. It's the same PowerPoint.
Yeah,
and he's never been able to advance beyond it, and he's never addressed the issue about source checking Sanford and his little crew.
Nope. I was actually trying to decide today whether I should do my, because I have a genetic entropy video in the list, and I was trying to decide whether I would do that next. But I was told today by someone that I was kind of focusing a lot on creationists recently, and so I was like, okay, well, I'll do something that's more positive rather than just beating on creationists. So my next video is going to be not about creationists.
Well, that's good, because we have to remember that that's actually reminding a very important point. That creationism bumps into only about 10% of the data field. So any of us who focus on the things that creationists screw up on are in a tunnel vision mode by definition, because they're tunnel vision. And then you open up the doors and you're looking at the giant field of science out there, and you go, wee, and you go out into the actual data field. You're far away from where creationists are touching on, in the same way that Old Scratch says, what monobaromen are myocytes in? Well, RJ, fat chance on getting an answer on that one. Yeah.
RJ, C. Brown put in a link to the Amphision Wikipedia page, which does not anywhere say that it's a myth. So what the heck?
So C. Brown, please do up your monograph on what you think myocytes were, when they lived, what their fossil data are. How do you account for their taphonomy and formation, since you're a young Earth creationist who think they died in the flood, I guess. So please work out what you think happened, post it somewhere so we can all take a look at it and look at your sources. And we would be absolutely delighted to do that. But so far, you have been very reluctant to do that, and I would suspect because you don't know diddly squat about it. Now, let me put up my shameless plug here and explain all the wonderful people who are project. We're about halfway through the show. And then RJ goes through the ritual of the screen share. Here we go. Okay. Wee zot. And there we go. And there are all of our wonderful patrons, our colleagues Andrew and Hendrel and Eric, our researchers Keith and Fenno and Brad and Ralph and Meet Convert Me and Pelagia. Yay, Pelagia! So, Pelagia was very instrumental in pushing me on to the whole concept of the GoFundMe, beyond that, and the Patreon. And there are a lot of people that get a lot of them. And now that I've loosened up the actual finances, so it's coming, it is enormously helpful. It is just a breath of fresh air to have that money coming in as a steady thing that I can anticipate, and everyone else that can help enormously so. And our assistant researchers, Dyer and Duranko and James and Kyle Frick and Nanya. I like to say not available, because that's what it looks like on the Staggles and Surus and Totes Real. Surus out there, yeah, I got to record more chapters for the book. for Paralogs of Fog, and still eventually get down to revamping the Evolution Slam Dunk for an ebook. That's going to be a fun project to tackle. Anyway, future things. I'm always damn busy. And Eat Meal and Stephen and the friends and Marigale and Insects Are Cool. Hello, you're in the room here. I'm well aware of you, Insects. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Daniel and Bo and Alex and Paul and Zeshi and some legacy patrons, Jen and John and Mona and Son and Everett, who supported in earlier things, but they're not on a regular basis now. Believe me, it is enormously, I'm enormously grateful for all the help you have done. There's the Patreon thing that everyone can do, and there's the link in the video description as usual. There's still the GoFundMe up. That's another route, and then tortucanwordpress.com, which is a clunky, basic WordPress thing that I still haven't got the hang of it. So I plead extenuating old fart in all of this, but I'm clunking along as best I can, and one of these days things will be better, and we'll get working on stuff. But at the moment, I will say that I'm focusing very tightly on the next book, because that's one that everyone will have access to, plus it's a potential revenue stream thing. And it's a highly relevant... Shutting down my little thing. Why won't you respond? Okay, come on. There we go. Anyway, the neat thing about... Still seeing weird screens on my thing anyway. Hopefully this computer is not jamming up on there. Well, okay. Anyway, I'm when I think about where I started only a few years ago, with no books out and no video presence, what I'm doing here. Cy Strike was the one that talked me into doing this, where he says, hey, you need to be spreading this kind of stuff around in here. And there is a madness to my method, in that there is an underlying superstructure to what I've been doing, which is to get more and more people onto the whole idea of source methods as an approach to problems generally, and to anti-evolutionism specifically. And that there are a lot of people who have been doing functionally that. I'm trying to highlight that. Pelagia, Jackson, you were doing all of that in your video. You would look up what people have been talking about and analyzing things. Pelagia was using that. I didn't invent source methods, duh. But I'm trying to make it a much more pivotal central element that people will be resorting to as a fundamental thing. Too many people who debate creationists, for example, are not approaching it from a source methods direction. They're approaching it from a top-down philosophy and data floor and throw facts at them and all of that, without looking at, well, how did they come up with their argument, and how does that compare to the way you're constructing your argument? There's a big difference between those. And I will put it to you as a general principle that if you scratch somebody that believes something that's really not true, they're going to be a Tortucan mind who is addicted to secondary sources. They don't work out what they think happened. They don't allow evidence to change their mind. They're relying on an extremely narrow data field. Those are the four core problems of all wooism. And creationism is a fabulously detailed example of that. So it has an advantage over flat Earth or moon landing hoaxers or things like that, 9/11 conspiracy theorists. All of that is relatively recent. Anti-evolutionism has a really long track record. And you've got an awful lot of people involved in it, in some cases so long that you get to see their entire career. Duane Gish lives and dies over the course of 40 years or so. And so you've got a huge field of information that you can draw off of to observe behavior. And you can compare that to the behavior of everybody else. And the very act of researching at a source methods level is beautifully ideal, because you're not only finding out why they have their head up their ass, but you're also finding out the primary source information, and your argument is improved. I've learned so much co-authoring this book with Jackson. You are a persnicketily brilliant man when it comes to all of the terminology and the taxa material that you can just rattle off at the drop of a hat, and I can't. So I have to follow through on that. And I have literally, in all the times that you have given me your videos to vet, I have never found a single one where there weren't sources in there and issues that I didn't know about, that I then followed up on and researched more on. And then sometimes I'm able to hit another ball back. Hey, did you know about this paper? Boop. And that improves all of our game. It's a no-lose situation.
Did that happen with my last video?
Oh, yeah, all of that. Yeah, I'm always connecting up with stuff. And I was very happy to supply Jackson with some information directly from Steve Meyer, because I happen to have his cell book. So I was able to copy off the sections and PDF them and send them on to him so he could see exactly what Meyer does. Meyer is a fabulous example of somebody where there's less than there than meets the eye. It may be a big book that's 400 pages long, but there's only 800 sources in it. And even then, when you start looking at point information blips, you're finding that things aren't as powerful as they appeared to be when you start looking at that from that level. So
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Meyer is all facade, I think. You know, he wrote a whole book about paleontology. But if you read, you know, for instance, Prothero's review of his book on Darwin's Doubt, his whole book on the Cambrian explosion, it's, you know, just ridiculous through and through, misrepresents data. The little bit that I looked at, or that we looked at for this past video I made, he made up his numbers, right? At the very least, if he didn't make them up, he didn't
math straight. What is it when he's off by orders of magnitude on his own numbers?
Yeah, it was just that he compared these interactions, these prebiotic interactions, to flipping a coin, which, if you know anything about chemistry, reactions don't proceed entirely randomly. There are factors at play in the chemistry and the physics that are governing how they're going to, you know,
hydrophobic and hydrophilic, for example, are things that are functions of basic chemistry. They're unavoidable. That's the whole issue, trying to figure out how lipid membranes formed, is how some things will just naturally end to end, where there's a hydrophobic end on one end and a hydrophilic end on the other, and it can't avoid doing that. It's inevitable.
Yeah, and it was interesting because it really didn't take too long to find a source that said the exact opposite of what he was saying, because he makes the claim in his book that he tries to, you know, beat us to the pass, saying that, oh, it couldn't have started off as a small protein that got bigger because it wouldn't have been able to fold properly. Well, actually, you know, a short search through the literature will show that yes, the all the earliest amino acids could fold properly, and it's
we got a question from.
He could have known.
I was just curious, misspelled again, what James thought about this master gene that programs the entire genome during embryonic development. There isn't one.
Yeah,
it's a collection of things. Please identify what this alleged master gene is. That one of the this makes a good. Oh, jump in, Jackson.
Oh, I was just going to say. So notice how I sent him a link to a paper on the phylogenetics of Caeniformes. He has now jumped topic to something else.
Typical for C, and that's typical actually for most grassroots creationists. You can find somebody, if somebody up at Michael Denton's level can kind of stay on topic, but you'll find the grassroots are basically gish gallopers, that if you challenge them on a point they bring up, and suddenly they're starting to complain about it, well, then they'll jump to another one. And then if you start challenging them on that one, they'll jump to another one. So, Standing for Truth was doing that same point. It's always jump to some other rock
or Sylvester
that they have an argument that they wish to be true. I'll point out that there's the second half of the show is basically on some the postings. I always like to put stuff that I've encountered along the way that's sort of interesting, that it relates to how anti-evolutionists at the grassroots are doing and the technicals are doing this stuff. And Evolution News is constantly putting crap up. And I go, yeah, I investigate the crap and look up the primary sources, and then you can look up too. So I put up about 2 or 3 of Evolution News fairly recent postings on introns and membranes and a few other things. And they're riffing off of technical literature. Unfortunately, the ones are pretty much available open access. So I put the links into those too, so you can read out what they're referring to. And the problem is that there's more to it than that. And you would need to find out about how membranes work and the evolutionary origin of their various components and all. And they're tripping over the theodicy issue. Because, for example, one of the things that they relate to the membrane issue is connected up with epilepsy, and malfunctions in it are dangerous. and it's doing a thing that it does naturally, but it can be easily done with mutations and the like. So you'd have to argue that if these were designed, were they designed defectively, that had downsides? We would sue companies that had that. You know, our planes fly. They were dealing with the 737 right now. You know, our planes fly really well until they crash. And at that point, you go, uh-oh, wait a minute, something is seriously wrong here. I feel sorry for Boeing. That's in my state in there, because they may be bumping into a Comet example. The Comet was the first jet plane in public service back in the 1950s. The British were so far ahead of everybody, it hurt. But it really hurt when they started crashing. And there was a serious design flaw in it that they had not anticipated. It was in the very early days. It had to do with pressures and stress on metals and a particular window that failed. And it was just a sad circumstance. And it threw them so far off to correct it before they came out with the Comet 2 that by that time Boeing was out with its 707 and the DC-9 and all that. And so they were now behind the curve, and they never really caught up. So these things can be troublesome. But anyway, the whole issue behind the genetics that anti-evolutionists like the Discovery Institute wants to play around with, a lot of it is in the gee whiz category. Well, ooh, look at how complicated this is. And that's partly what they're doing here, where they're saying that, ooh, there's introns going on here, and yeast. One of the papers relates to how introns apparently play an interesting role in yeast when they're in a starvation mode, that there are things about it that they don't yet understand that are causing it to be more resilient in starvation mode. It's able to sense its environment better with this clutter of introns in the gene. And so the thing is that I will wager that when the dust settles, it'll all be completely natural and evolutionary. It's not because some designer has thought, you know, yeast need to be able to survive a special environment. So I, the creator of the Most High, I shall create in them introns in yeast. I can't ban slavery, but I'm concerned about yeast introns. And so it's a weird evasion. But the problem is I don't anticipate any of this stuff is going to turn out to be any less natural and evolutionary. Introns are a really fascinating thing for those of you who need a primer on it. Exons are the coding genes that actually produce the proteins. Introns are interspersed in them, and they vary. In fact, there's an actual tendency. I think I put a linkage up to it. The tendency is for yeast to actually edit out most of those introns over time. So in most of the circumstances, they probably aren't useful. And you can literally, and it's been done, you can edit out all of the introns, and the yeast doesn't drop dead. So clearly they are doing something, if at all, that is not directly related to the function of the gene. And this is one example that they apparently create an environment that makes it able to function a little better in the stress times when it doesn't have a good input of food. So it's an interesting little unintended consequence of things. But the intriguing thing is that introns play a role in alternative splicing, to where ubiquitous in vertebrates is the fact, and including us, is the reason why we've only got 25,000 genes to create 100,000 proteins, is the same gene strung out in components can be taken piecemeal and plugged together to make multiple different proteins. Why? Because proteins evolve, and they come from multiple new systems are generated by plugging together modules that occur in the course of the natural process of making stuff. And that eventually turns into new systems that develop into new forms and all the rest. And this is far from the master control gene that C. Brown wants to throw on out of that. So by all means, stick a reference up for that in the commentary section so we can share with the class C as to what you think involved here. And it'll be fun to find out. By the way, C, I suspect you're a parasitical citer, and that you get your science-y stuff secondhand from creationist sources. So please do the honor of at least being honest about your parasitism. And if you have gotten a technical paper or some notion from a creationist source, by all means, you go ahead and cite the technical literature, but cite the creationist source you got it from too. Be honest. Don't imply that you have been scavenging around through the technical journals and you, at dint of your own effort, have found all of the stuff on your own.
That's like that George Rodriguez guy who
reading. Well, I call him your gay, but that's
He said he was reading the literature on the ice fish proteins, and then I copied the tweets he was sending out, and they led right to an Evolution News article. He was copying it word for word.
Oh yeah, yeah, and that's why I've been able to spot that a lot, even in tweets. There was one creationist who threw up a technical reference, and I was thrown off by the way it was worded, and I suddenly realized he had lumped Dembski and Wells together as if that was one name. And when I looked up the thing they were talking about, it turned out to be from a Dembski and Wells posting at Evolution News.
Of course.
So if you're going to be a copier and a parasite, at least be a tidy one who checks spelling. And that, of course, if you're really thorough on copying exactly, you turn into Kent Hovind, because that's how I spotted that he had copied from Hyun Yaya, because he had slavishly copied every single paragraph, point by point by point, even down to the placements of brackets and colons and all that. And that proved to be the undoing, because you could track all that stuff down. So sometimes the exact text wording is really useful to be able to find provenance on these things. If you want to be discuss technical literature, any creationist, fine and dandy, but be aware that source methods means we're going to find out how you got that information and why you're talking about that paper and not somebody else's paper. And another thing, I probably be putting maybe a reference on it someday in the future, but I've been having more interactions. Remember James Cole, that wacky younger creationist?
The nurse guy,
he's on Twitter. God, he's an oddball. And he keeps on lobbing papers at me that he thinks are showing his argument, and they don't. That somehow or other they're confirming his weird idea about genetics, and they don't.
I'm concerned for his mental health whenever I see his feed, because he's always constantly going on about microRNAs, and then he sends a paper. Then someone will say, what does that have to do with this? And he'll send a paper about the topic you were talking about that doesn't say anything about what he's talking about. And he'll say it's
and he seems to think that's going to overly impress me. C. Brown in the chat says, it is not difficult to go to Google Scholars and find scientific papers. It is not difficult at all. That is correct. What is difficult is understanding it. He said, and at the moment, you have not mastered that task.
He says he's posted his alleged link to this Master Gene article 10 times, but there's nothing there. Maybe just try putting in the title of it.
Well, I have tried to keep. I respond always to C. Brown, and so if he's mentioned it before, he may already have gotten comments on the thing. That, of course, there are genes that play roles in all sorts of contexts, but if you want to talk about any master control genes, at best, you probably, in animals, you're really talking about a variety of homeobox genes. Those function as master regulators all through the cascades of things that produce the reason why we look different from a cockroach, even though we use functionally the core same toolkit of homeobox genes. But there are you can talk about aspects of things, but none of it still appears to be non-evolutionary. That they function in completely natural ways, and it's revealing that you can't get C. Brown or anybody else to deal with the reptile-mammal transition. That one is a beautiful data set that I know all the ups and downs on, and I know every possible anti-evolutionist counter-argument to it. So therefore, I know exactly what he would be copying from, and creationists tend to shy away from that stuff. There would be shameless plug for Evolution Slam Dunk Gang. I got the link up in the thing. If you don't have a copy of Evolution Slam Dunk, why not? Because I'm very, very proud of the work, and I've done an awful lot of effort on it to create a work that filled a hole that was not properly covered, and that now is. And anybody who has Slam Dunk will be able to be up to speed on the reptile-mammal transition material and every single anti-evolutionist who's ever blundered into the field. So you'll know an awful lot more about how Michael Denton runs astray, and how Dwayne Gish was pirouetting, and how Elizabeth Mitchell does not know how to think, and all of that.
So he posted the link, and I'll send it to you, RJ. I'll put it right here in our little side, or our.
Oh, is this his supposed master control gene?
Global development gene programming involves a nuclear form of fibroblast growth factor receptor 1.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, I don't have my my master bibliography up, but I'm pretty sure that already looked into this thing, and it's not what he seems to think it is. Fibroblasts and all, they're a fascinating little bunch. And as I said, if I don't have my word processor thing up, so I don't have my bibliography there. But the C is typical of grassroots creationists who will latch on to buzzwords and things that they have gotten from the sources that they don't tend to discuss. And he was defending, he apparently bought Rupe and Sanford's contested bones out of annoyance that I was criticizing it. So Rupe and Sanford got one book sale out of their thing. And I'd like to see more people counter that with my evolution slam dunk. And then when we get done with the thing, the rocks were there, which will be filling another hole. We were very tactical about the fact that there was a whole swath of creationist apologetics that hasn't really been covered properly in the anti-creationist literature. There are snippets here and there. Some people have gone after little bits and pieces of Tompkins and Sanford and all the rest, but really that the kind of comprehensive hammer blow, boom, 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 that needed to be done on all of this stuff hadn't really been done, and not all in one place. So I think this will be a genuine contribution to the field of the area, and it'll be ridiculously up to date. We've already got some 2019 technical papers flopping in there. In fact, I'm still waiting for that one on molecular mechanism and history of nonsense to sense evolution of antifreeze glycoprotein gene in northern gadids that has not yet appeared in publication at PNAS. And as soon as it does, then I'll have the full reference on it, and that'll go into that little section on the antifreeze protein in fish. It's a constant reminder to us both how vastly interesting the science field is, and the mindset of people who play scavenge trawler to try to pick up things that are problems for evolution that aren't. And as if this is in lieu of offering their argument. If you want to believe in intelligent design, fine and dandy. Tell me how many design events there were. What would a design event look like? How would you distinguish it from just natural evolution? And tackle it with the data. Take anything you want, any fossil record that you would like to have, any genetic field of living organisms that you want, and work out what your model is. Fine and dandy. But you and I both know, in reading both intelligent design and creationist literature, they don't have a model. They have an anti-model of things they don't want to be true. Behe's always avoided thinking through his argument. Denton certainly has. He's had 30 years to work out what the hell he thinks happens with anything, and he still can't work it out. If you read the tail end of it where he offers speculations on things, it's still the same vague something designy-ish happens somewhere in some things. And that's as literally as far as he can go, because there's no model there. It's just an anti-Darwinism, anti-naturalism thing. The problem is we can see way too much evidence that it is natural. And the same thing with epigenetics. That's another little buzzword that pops up in anti-evolutionism is, oh, it's non-genetic. Well, not quite. And it's also perfectly natural. And in fact, I have a whole little section on it in one of my tip modules.
We also mention it briefly in our book, because Purdom brings it up for a cheap little gotcha, which is kind of irrelevant to the rest of the chapter. So it's very bizarre.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. And the thing that really will, I'm sure you found this already in what you've written on that, and I've noticed it on mine, is that on any area where they have, they're touching on really important technical issues, their documentation is really thin.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I was blown away how superficial Michael Denton has remained. That he will cite technical literature, but when you look underneath the surface, you realize that he's not reading that very closely, and he's not doing in-depth backgrounding to create a deeper argument on the thing, to buttress his non-existent argument. So C. Brown, by all means, do that monograph and write that paper up, and let's see what the hell you're doing. not just snarking at things to the side. Because C. Brown is a young Earth creationist, apparently. He presumably doesn't like radiometric dating or any of these other stuff, but you're going to have to get into that too if you're going to try to contest with the chronology. Because if you want to think all of the fossil record is occurring at the time of Egypt building the pyramids, you better get involved with archaeology too. So you have a big field of stuff to deal with, and go right ahead and do that. But I'm not anticipating you doing that because you haven't shown it much so much.
Yeah.
Insects are cool, says Jackson Wheat. Oh, speaking of Behe, what's your response to Behe's claim that flagella motors are too complex? That's a fun one.
I did do a video a while back about the evolution of the flagellum, and I went about it in 3 prongs. It was that there are detailed explanations of how it evolved. You can do experiments where you increase its function and also take out parts and show that it still works. So the fact that you can both add to it and take away from it, it's not irreducibly complex.
The big interest on its evolution is that it apparently started out not being a flagellum for motility.
Right.
It was a secretion system. And part of the things that, you get into just headstands of the intelligent design movement on this, where they say, well, all of the flagellum couldn't have evolved from the type 3 secretion system because the type 3 secretion system was imported from the flagellum system.
Nope.
In living organisms, yes. But the issue is, what was the flagellum doing before it became a flagellum? It's a secretion system. It still is. That's how it's assembled.
Yeah.
There's still
to the outside.
Yeah. There's still ongoing work on it, and the intelligent design movement has not shown itself to be a particularly cutting edge one. You find Scott Minnick down in the University of Idaho actually does flagellum research, and he's done a little bit of snippets on the material. He's a kind of a mid-echelon player, but a lot of the people that are the real players, movers, are over in Japan. They've been doing an enormous amount of work on it. I think they've just recently found the homology with the motor proteins that had been mysterious before, but where they're coming from. That's the thing that actually turns the flagellum. And then there's still the interesting issue about flagellum stuff auto-assembles. If you have a vat of flagellum, it immediately forms filaments all on its own. The interesting thing about the flagellum as a motility system is that it does it in low concentrations, and it does it because there's this cap that acts as a frame for the flagellum to be squirted up and forming together. And they're still investigating what the hell's going on with that. And I'll guarantee you that Scott Minnick will not be the one to make breakthroughs on this point, that it'll be the regular scientists.
I mean, it seems like it's not just the flagellum that self-assembles. It's a lot of all the proteins that are involved in the flagellum were already present elsewhere. They were just kind of cobbled together, and they can also make the form that they're in the flagellum on their own. They don't need the cell.
They're also, if you ask Bill Dembski and Ken Miller did, when the flagellum was designed, he doesn't want to think about that. And that's more that map of time stuff. C. Brown says, allow me on the show where we can discuss this. No. So you were led on the show once before, and you couldn't answer straight questions. You didn't want to have a conversation. You wanted to spew your propaganda creationism. And my time is too short on that. You want to do your own little show, find it Andy. But on my show, if you can't answer a straight question and have a discussion, then you're a waste of time.
Oh, yeah.
So you can make all of the arguments you want, and you have. I've not blocked you at all on any of the videos. I could easily edit out your comments. I have control over my videos. If I wanted to get rid of you on the comments on the videos, I could. But no, I feel that I'm doing my scholarly honor, that you get to shoot your mouth off and everybody gets to see, and I will let everybody see that.
When I had my discussion with Sylvester Williams recently, it's like over an hour of him not answering a single question. You know, he couldn't answer anything. He couldn't tell me what the definition of evolution was, how it worked. He asked about living fossils, but then when I asked him, he couldn't answer any questions. He knew literally nothing about any of the topics.
Yeah, and that's often the case with a lot of grassroots creationists. That they have buzzwords, they have material they've gleaned secondhand, but they don't actually understand them. They only understand the talking points. And their entire conception is imported secondhand, that their notion of evolution is based on what creationists say evolution is. So they're allowing one side to tell them what both sides of an argument are. And that's not a way of doing stuff. You need to let the ring of truth come through. You need to look at the primary source data field. Oh, Jackson probably had a glitch there, and he's disappeared. So I'm on my own here. Oh, it's 6 o'clock anyway. I'll be wrapping this up pretty soon. But the evolution news stuff that I have in on those postings, and also the papers that I put in on the Rupe and Sanford book, are all opportunities. I don't expect everybody to spend their time reading all the technical papers that I put up, and it's not necessarily to do that. But they're there so people can do that. Theoretically, I could list every single source that they do, but an awful lot of them are not available to everybody online, in which case you can't follow up, and therefore you cannot do a source analysis on that. C. Brown asked, Jackson, if that's the case, why won't you debate Standing again? It seems that you're running for him. Piffle sticks. I personally have no problem with debating him again, and Jackson, I'm sure, would have no difficulty on that. But the problem is that all you get from Standing is the same runaround every single time. Every single debate I've seen of him, and now it's like 3 or 4, he has the same shtick. He has his same little PowerPoint that he puts up. It's like Kent Hovind, and it's the same talking points. It's the same examples over and over and over again, and you cannot get him to address whether or not his arguments are correct. You can't drive Standing to analyze whether or not Sanford got his math right to begin with. Sanford didn't get his math right to begin with. He was misrepresenting Kimura. He ignored data field, and that's why genetic entropy has no importance in the regular scientific community. No one's paying any attention to it because it isn't true. It's incorrect. And the only people who are favoring it are glib creationists who want it to be true, and therefore repeat his argument secondarily. And Frustrated said, we read the paper, you apparently didn't. Life is too short for a lot of issues, but I have never shirked away from a debate myself. I wanted to debate Kent Hovind, and he's probably never going to come back on me because he knows that I do source methods, and he can't play that game. He never could. There was a Mark Huffman debate that I had that got broken off when he had to put his daughter to sleep, and he never has come back for part 2. That's been years. Why? Because I do source methods, and I'm going to be quizzing him on his source methods, and that's a game he cannot play because he's just a secondary citer, just like C. Brown is and everybody else. That they can't get past their anti-evolution creationism, and they never can work out what they think happened. I would be delighted to see a creationist model that is as detailed and clear as anything that you can find in the regular science issues. If you look at a creationist discussion, Andrew Snelling or anybody else on flood geology, it's a cartoon compared to what goes on in the regular technical literature, including stuff they've cited. So there I am at the end of I'm past 6 o'clock in here. I probably need to go off and get some soup and salad. And C. Brown, what argument did, if we're talking Standing for Truth has never explained how he has derived that the heterozygosity of a theoretical Adam and Eve and or Noah could account for all of the available genetic information. He keeps on rattling off stuff he's gotten secondarily from Jensen and others, but he's never fact-checked any of it. But those of us who have read the papers, and please, C. Brown, take out a Bible and swear upon it an imperilment of your eternal damnation and tell everybody, have you source-checked the material that is presented by the creationists that you read and copy? And I don't think you can say an honest yes to that, because you have never shown an ability to do that. Well, on that persnickety little moment, I shall be shutting the show down in here, and we will see you next week. And hopefully it'll be, with some temperatures are supposed to rise in here. We had a little bit of snow here, and it turns out I didn't need to do any shoveling because the temperature and wind, we have Chinooks that can just vaporize snow very quickly. And it's supposed to go into the 50s next week. Yay! And I would love to be in a position where I'll actually be able to try out my new lawnmower and find out where the batteries and all that work and all that, and welcome into the 21st century. So, and by the way, I was able to get a new lawnmower precisely because of the Patreon thing that allowed me to have a thing where I no longer have to depend upon dear sweet Scott and his electric lawnmower who would come over. So anyway, everybody that's on Twitter, follow me, interact with me. C. Brown can interact with me on Twitter if he jolly well feels like it. Fine and dandy. Anybody can pick my brain. I'm not hard to find. I don't have an avatar that's not my picture. I don't hide myself behind a facade the way others do. I'm upfront and open about this because ideas worth having are one worth defending, and stupid ideas are worth opposing honestly and openly. So there we go. That's the mantra that I will give you for today. And we will be shutting the show down and see you all next week. Hey, gang.